Parshas Bamidbar, this Shabbos, we bless the month of Sivan, which is the month in which we are going to be once again receiving the Torah and Shavuos. That would make it a good time to ask, what would be the best preparation for receiving the Torah? First of all, initially, when the Jewish people received the Torah literally at Sinai, what was the best preparation then? And if we now are once again going through this moment in time of giving of the Torah, of receiving the Torah, and we actually get to experience all the spiritual phenomena associated with that event again in a unique way that has never been experienced before, what would be the ultimate preparation for receiving the Torah?
I heard this once, where on Pesach we don't have matzahs because, a month before Pesach, because we're trying to satiate the taste of the matzahs. And so if we took that same approach for Torah, you can't say for a month we're not going to study Torah, so then what's the answer?
We definitely don't want to say that, correct. So let's talk about the answer. Something that comes to mind has just popped into my head now, and I think it's something that's important to talk about in and of itself, very important, and it's going to, I think, be a good analogy to what we're talking about here. A lot of times, if we see someone behaving in some particular way, whatever it is, something that's maybe a little bit unexpected, it's natural to respond to the behavior. It's instinctive, it's intuitive to respond to the behavior. So if you see someone who's getting really angry, right, the natural thing would be, depending on the circumstances, but assuming we're not in a situation where we have to actually physically protect ourselves from violence or anything, the natural instinct a person's likely to feel intuitively is, let me try to help this person calm down, let me help them feel better. Kids acting out in class, or kids acting out at home, whatever it is, natural intuitive response is, let me try to get the kid to behave better, whether it's through discipline or punishment or positive reinforcement, or that's a whole separate kind of worms that we're not going to get into now. But very often when someone, and this is true of children, it's true of adults are basically just big children, ultimately.
Big wax.
In some ways, and to varying degrees. When someone's behaving in a particular way, let's say someone's angry, someone's behaving in a way that's very aggressive or very reactive, or a child is really acting out in class, most likely, if not all of the time, there's something that you wouldn't necessarily obviously associate with the behavior that's behind the behavior, right? How many stories are there of children acting out in school, and the teachers and everybody's just coming down on them like a ton of bricks, and we're going to teach them and whatever it is, or trying positive reinforcement or whatever it is, and then you have one person who stops to think for a minute and says, let me talk to this kid and see what's going on, and then they find out about the things that are going on at home, or whatever it is. There's something behind the scenes that is not the obvious thing that we associate with being responsible for the behavior, but that's the driving force behind the behavior. Right now, if a kid is, let's say, experiencing a really difficult time at home, or a really difficult time with friends outside of the classroom, or whatever it is, something really difficult, right? And the emotions that their body produces in response to these difficulties are way too much for them to know what to do with or to handle. So what do? They feel emotionally overwhelmed, and they act out. So although the thing that's actually responsible for producing the behavior is not the thing that we would intuitively necessarily or obviously expect to be the thing that needs to be addressed, if the thing that's causing these overwhelming emotions that are just driving this kid to act out because they don't know what else to do, if we can help with providing support, with addressing that problem so that those overwhelming emotions aren't there anymore, Now the kid's going to be able to behave in a way that ultimately they probably always wanted to behave, they just were not in control of themselves. Right? So the best way to address something, whether it's to help something that's already happening or to prepare for something, the best way to address something is not necessarily, okay, what is this thing? What does it look like? What can we do to prepare for it? A lot of times we're going to do a much more profoundly effective job if we stop and ask ourselves, okay, what's really going on here? What is this really about? What's the thing, not that we see at surface level, but the thing that's behind the scenes, beneath the surface, that's really the engine driving this all? What's it really about? What's its real identity? And then let's see what we can do to tap into that, to address that, to prepare for that. Right? Because let's say when this child in this situation is acting out, are they making trouble? They're making trouble for the teachers, for the parents, for the people around them. They're making things difficult for them. But if you look at the actual identity of what they're doing, the body of what they're doing is making trouble. The identity and the soul of what they're doing is expressing their lostness, the fact that they don't know how to deal with what they're experiencing, they don't know how to deal with their emotions, they're expressing overwhelm, they're expressing pain, they're expressing frustration, confusion, perhaps all of the above. So when it comes to the giving of the Torah and the receiving of the Torah, if we want to really prepare in a way that's going to be the most impactful, the question, or a good question to start with is, okay, what is this really about? Not what does it look like, not what does it feel like, not what does it seem at face value is the obvious thing that it's about, but what's the soul of this? What's driving it? What's it, the true identity, the truest, deepest identity? And the deeper the layer we get to, the more profound the impact that preparation or work to help or support or whatever it is going to have. Assuming that we get it right and do the job correctly. So, the first word of the Aseret HaDibros, the Aseret HaDibros often translated as the Ten Commandments. It's actually not the Ten Commandments, that would be Aseret HaMitzvos. Aseret HaDibros ultimately is like the 10 utterances, is probably Maimoros better maybe, but 10 speakings really is probably the most technically precise translation, something along those lines, right? But Aseret HaDibros, aka the 10 Commandments, sorry? Maybe. I think it's a little bit deeper than that, because it's the speaking there's something about the act and the process of speaking that is very, very much related to what this is. But expressions would definitely be much more accurate than commandments, for sure. So, the first word of the Aseret HaDibros is Anochi. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God. Right? I'm not saying that for the video, in case someone clips that out so he thinks it's better. Hashem starts off the Aseret HaDibros saying, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. This is a very unusual word. There are many, many, many times that Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu, etc. speak in the first person throughout Torah. And if you ask someone, how do you say I in Hebrew? Yeah, no one's going to say Anochi. I mean, if someone only learned this verse, and that's the only Hebrew they learned, and they say Anochi Hashem Elokecha Hashem Yigad, you ask them how do you say I, they're going to say Anochi, but they're the only person who's ever going to respond that. Or someone who's trying to be funny. But the way that we say I in Hebrew is Ani, I. So why does Hashem say Anochi? So it's not actually, in truth, it's not actually etymologically a Hebrew word. It's not. It's a foreign word from another language that's sort of imported and integrated in the language. And the Talmud says that the reason is because of what this is an acronym for. And so the Ein Yaakov version of that is, Ein Yaakov is sort of a I don't know if anthology is quite the right word, but it's a collection of all the stories and midrashic parts of the Talmud all compiled without all the halachic discussions. and sometimes the wording is, has minor differences to the original one. So it says that the reason it says Anochi and not Ani is because this is an acronym for Ana, Nafshi, Ksavis, Yehovis. Now, in Ein Yaakov, what it's saying, Ana, Nafshi, Ksavis, Yehovis, is Hashem saying, Ana, I, Nafshi, myself, Ksavis, wrote this, Yehovis, and give it to you. I'm giving this to you. So, and because Hashem wanted to really open with that message that this is a gift and something that Hashem is personally giving to us, instead of saying Ani, he says Anochi, so it includes that. Now, there are other ways of translating not the acronym, but the actual words of the Ein Yaakov, and the truth is that a more literal translation of what the Ein Yaakov says would be Ana, I, Nafshi, my soul, Ksavis, have written, Yehovis, and presented. So Hashem says, I have placed myself inside of these words and presented them to you. Now, just to take a minute to appreciate what that means. Try to figure out how to do this without it taking like 7 hours.
Good luck.
If someone, let's say, someone wants to grow larger and or stronger muscles, what's the obvious pathway to doing that?
Weights.
Resistance training, lift weights, some sort of resistance training. Why? Because when we push our bodies to or close enough to the limit of our capacity to produce force, our bodies are going to recognize that our capacity is close to being tested. Maybe it's a good idea to increase our capacity to produce force so we'll be able to do more of it. Right? The growth of the muscles doesn't happen in the gym. The growth of the muscles happens primarily when we sleep, certainly afterwards. The workout, the exercise is a stimulus that gives the body to our message, to our physiology, that we should grow these muscles larger, stronger, etc. Why is it that if we want to be able to lift up something heavier, or lift up something heavy more times, or push something heavier, whatever it is, our muscles need to become bigger and or stronger? And you're going to be like, hang on a second, what are you asking? Oops, okay, see how we go. And just take care of this now before. Oh, this one's also great. Let's see how we go. Okay. So, and the reason why you might be wondering, hang on, what is he asking, is because the question is that simple that it seems silly. Because muscles produce force. That's what muscles do, right? Muscle tissue has one job, which is to contract. The only thing that a muscle knows how to do is to contract, to shorten itself. If a muscle is attached to one bone at one end via a tendon, and then to another bone at another end via a tendon at the other end, and that muscle shortens itself, as it shortens, it's going to shorten the distance between those two bones, it's going to bend the joint, flex the joint. So a muscle's job is to produce force, which it does. It has fibers and they pull against each other, etc. So muscles, in the form of contracting, becoming shorter, produce force. Because a muscle's job, physical job, is to produce force in the form of contracting, the stronger and or bigger the muscle is, not or, but perhaps and to a degree, there's a big correlation. Let's say the stronger the muscle is, the more force it can produce. And because muscles produce force, and the stronger the muscle, the more force it can produce. So as a muscle becomes stronger, as the body responds and adapts by strengthening the muscles further, they can produce more force and they can do more work, produce more output. Yeah, right? Connection. What does that have to do? It doesn't necessarily seem as intuitive, but the same exact thing is true of our brains. When we learn something, you learn a piece of information, a fact, anything. The information that we learn is physically stored inside our brain cells. There is a neurochemical, physiological phenomenon that occurs inside the cells of our brains, in those neurons, that is the physical component of us storing that information. So when we learn something, that information, the storage of that information is a physical phenomenon that occurs in our brains. This information is literally physically stored inside our neurons. Right? When a person's thinking, memorizing, trying to recall, you can measure electrical activity on the brain. It's a very physical thing. We think of it maybe intuitively as being the mind, which is this abstract thing, and it's true. But the mind is a phenomenon that is associated with, it's perhaps we could call it an abstract phenomenon that's associated with, inextricably, the brain. So when we learn, it doesn't matter what we learn. You learn 1 + 1 = 2. If someone doesn't know that 1 + 1 = 2 and we teach them that 1 + 1 = 2, and then tomorrow we ask them what does 1 + 1 equal and they say 2, how do they know that? They didn't know it 2 days ago. Well, they know it. And this again, it might sound like duh, but because we taught them that yesterday, so they still know it today. Well, how do they still know it today? They heard something yesterday. Well, it's called memory. It's called memory. What does that mean? Well, is it in the air? No, memory is a physical thing in our brains. And the extent, what we have is, going back to how we open this up, right? If you want to address something or prepare for something in a way that's going to be the most impactful and effective, you want to get down to what's the deepest identity of it and then address it at that level. What is the receiving of the Torah? We receive the Torah. Ultimately, it is about us being able to integrate the absolute infinity of Hashem, Hashem's soul, so to speak, whatever that means, into ourselves through study of the Torah. Torah is about us and Hashem becoming one. In a very sort of impossible, physical, spiritual, chalent, but partly very in a physical, tangible way, being stored, Hashem being stored inside, literally in the neurons in our brains, in the cortex of our brains. So this is about us becoming one with Hashem, integrating the infinity of Hashem into ourselves. How is it that we are in a position to be able to integrate the infinity of Hashem into ourselves? It does, there are so many reasons why that doesn't make any sense and it shouldn't be possible. And the answer is quite simple in a sense. That every single one of us, our deepest and most true identity is the infinity of Hashem that is inside of us, that is beneath all the different layers of our personalities, the layers of our soul and personality and character, spiritually, physically, all of that. Beneath all of that is the absolute infinity of Hashem that is within every one of us. So it actually makes a whole lot of sense that we should be able to integrate and become one with Hashem and integrate Hashem into us, because we are one with Hashem. The question then becomes, well, if we are, hang on, whoa, let's slow down a second. If my truest identity is the absolute infinity of Hashem, which cannot be defined, and the truest identity of every single one of you and every single one of us collectively is the absolute infinity of Hashem, does that mean that we're all the same? Or say, well, it's not our body, it's our soul, right? Our godly soul, our divine soul is the absolute infinity of Hashem. So does that mean all of our souls are the same? We always talk about how every one of us is unique and our soul is unique. I mean, you can't have multiple unique different parts of Hashem, because then they're not absolutely infinite. We just talked, actually, it was not such a bad introduction, that conversation about the world and gravity and all of that. By definition, that which is absolutely infinite cannot be described, because a description is the articulation of a definition which depends on limiting factors, limiting characteristics, defining characteristics. You cannot have different parts of absolute infinity because they're not absolute infinite.
Wait, you can't have multiple parts of infinity?
Different. You can't have different parts of infinity.
What do you mean?
If you can divide infinity up into the blue part and the red part, then it was never absolutely infinite. It was blue and red.
How can it be both at the same time? And if you look at fractals in that way also.
Let's say something like white light, and then you divide it up, right, into different wavelengths. White light is a combination of a spectrum of wavelengths of light with equal distribution. It's not infinite. It's very, very specifically defined, and we know exactly what's there. And for white light to be white, it depends on exactly the right balance of all of those wavelengths being there together. It's not infinite at all. It's a very specifically defined phenomenon, which is a composite, but it's not a composite of infinite anything. It's a composite of a very specific, finite, very clearly and very specifically defined components, let's say, that come together to create the composite. If something is, and this is why I say absolutely infinite, if it's absolutely infinite, then there really isn't any description or definition that you can give, because any description or definition necessarily is the articulation of a limiting characteristic or a defining characteristic. And a defining characteristic by definition is a limitation. Even if you define something as being infinite, that's a limitation because it's infinite and it's not finite. And it actually says that Hashem is absolutely infinite, to the extent that, I'm adding that in parenthetically, just like Hashem is infinite and contains infinity, Hashem also is the beginning and contains finiteness and limitation. Because if you say Hashem is just infinite and there is no finitude within Hashem, then that is a limitation. You have limited Hashem to being only infinite and not finite, which is not absolute infinity. That's a very specifically defined infinity. And it is the case that Hashem is absolutely infinite, then there is no limiting or defining characteristic that you can articulate that is true of Hashem. And so Hashem is no more limited to being infinite as we perceive infinity than he is limited to being 1 or 2 or 5 or 0. Right? Infinity, the concept of infinity originates within Hashem. The concept of finitude and the phenomenon of limitation and definition originates within Hashem, because it's absolute infinity. If something's absolutely infinite, you can't define or separate anything. And that is kind of what we were getting at with the idea of the sphere. There is no top and bottom, there's no beginning and end, there's no anything. It's just continuous and perfectly symmetrical. So on one hand we say every one of us has the infinity of Hashem within us. On the other hand we say that we all have these unique souls and etc., etc. And that those are not contradictory, because in Yiddish there's an expression that we say, es wenn sich wundert, which means it depends what we're talking about. Which can be very frustrating when people respond that to, difficult questions. It can feel like a cop-out. Honestly, I think that if we would do the data, run the data on every time someone has responded to a question with that, probably, I'm guessing, a good majority of the times were a cop-out. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a cop-out, because when we're talking about things that are abstract, it is very context specific and context dependent. Now, every one of us, our truest, deepest, most absolute identity is an instance. I wouldn't even say a piece or a portion, because that is a limitation. I would say it's an instance of not that I think instance is the right word, but it's the least incorrect word that I've encountered so far. An instance of the absolute infinity of Hashem. Look at us, we're not all just the absolute infinity of Hashem, right? Every instance of the absolute infinity of Hashem has been subjected to a process of, let's say, it's almost, we could call it a process of development or evolution, but it's a downward development where it has layers layered over it, layers that are increasingly more and more limited, increasingly less and less aware of the absolute truth, less and less in touch with Hashem. And these are the various layers of the soul, etc., until we get to the way that we experience ourselves, our souls, our identity, our personality consciously, which is very different to the absolute infinity of Hashem. But that doesn't change the fact that who we are beneath all of those layers is still the absolute infinity of Hashem. Right, now, if we look at the Torah's description of what happened when we came to Mount Sinai, right, so the verse says, it says, Vayichan, we arrived at Mount Sinai, Har Sinai, where Hashem was giving us the Torah. On Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the first day, which is going to be this Friday, it says, Vayichan Sham Yisroel, which loosely translated, and the Jewish people camped there. But Vayichan doesn't mean and they camped. It means and he camped in the singular. It's like there were only approximately 2 million of us. Like, yeah, let's just refer to us in the singular. And Rashi comments and says, why does it say Vayichan in the singular? It says, Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, because we were like one person with one heart. There was all, I mean, everybody knows, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions, at least. Imagine 2 million Jews about to receive the Torah. Like 2 million Jews in a conversation about Torah, good luck. But Rashi says, no, the truth is that in Egypt for sure, but the whole way, all of these 49 days that we were, 43-ish days that we were getting there, there was debate, there were fights, there were arguments. We arrived at Mount Sinai all of a sudden, like one person with one heart. What happened? We approached Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. Why did we come to Har Sinai? To get the Torah. What is the Torah? The Torah is Hashem presenting the absolute infinity of Himself to us. How is it possible that we are in a situation to receive that, to integrate that? Because we are deep down at our deepest layer of our identity and self and truth, the absolute infinity of Hashem. How many different variations can you have of the absolute infinity of Hashem? 0. There aren't variations of absolute infinity. We just talked about this, right? Absolute infinity is absolute infinity. There can't be variations of it. So at our deepest personal truth, our deepest identity, the deepest layer of who we actually are identical beneath the layers. So because we came to Har Sinai to get the Torah, the absolute infinity of Hashem, which was going to be presented to us, Hashem says, I am going to write and present to you in these words myself, my soul. That absolute infinity of Hashem called out when we arrived at the mountain. It called out to the absolute infinity of us, within us, the absolute infinity of Hashem within us. And that came out and was expressed. When the absolute infinity within each of us is expressed and it gets to actually be who we are for a short period of time, what happens? Yeah, there's harmony. There's perfect synchronicity and harmony because we are actually all the same. And that's why Rashi says, specifically Rashi says, Ki'ish echad, like one person, b'leiv echad, with one heart. Why was there no argument? Why was there synchronicity and harmony? Because we were actually like one person. The part of us that came out when we got there was the same. So because we were ultimately, effectively identical, so we were all in harmony and agreement. Interesting to draw this contrast. There's a similar thing it says about the Egyptians chasing us, right? When we're coming to the splitting of the sea, the Egyptians are chasing us, and it says Vayonos, and he chased. So Rashi says, why does it say and he chased? The Egyptians chased us? It wasn't he, it was lots and lots and lots of people, thousands and thousands of them. So he says a very similar thing, but a bit different. He says they were b'leiv echad ki'ish echad, with one heart, like one person. First they had one heart, they had a common interest. Their common interest was, well, let's get the Jews. Sound familiar? So because they had a common interest, that common interest united them and brought them together to behave like one person. So he says, B'leiv echad, with one heart, ke'ish echad. And because of that one heart, that common interest, they became like one person. Here it's the reverse. Ke'ish echad, we were like one person, and therefore b'leiv echad, we had the harmony, the synchronicity, the oneness, because we were ultimately identical, the same one person. And this is because of what the true identity of the giving of the Torah is. It's Hashem giving the absolute infinity of Himself to us. That absolute infinity of Hashem called out the absolute infinity of us, and there was oneness. So if that's the truest identity of what happened at Mount Sinai, what is going to be the best preparation for that? The best preparation for us to receive the Torah again this Shavuos? Let's reverse engineer it. We don't have the capacity to just turn on and wake up and call out the absolute infinity of Hashem within us. But what we can do is try to work things in reverse, right? Because in reality, most things work in both directions. Very often there's a dominant direction and let's say a secondary direction, right? Our thoughts can influence our feelings, which can influence our behaviors, but our behaviors can influence our feelings and our thoughts also, right? It works in both directions. So yes, when the absolute infinity of Hashem is awakened within us, that's naturally going to make us have this harmony and synchronicity, that oneness, where we all behave b'leiv echad, with one heart together, because we are ke'ish echad, we are one. Now that we can't do, but we can work it in reverse. If we spend the lead up to Shavuos focusing on thinking first of all, and really meditating on and integrating and believing, not just in our heads, but believing in our bodies and feeling in our bodies that we are one, that we all share the identical absolute of infinity of Hashem within us, and that's the truest identity of who we are. And we can believe that and feel it in our bodies to a degree that we actually start to have the appropriate feeling towards each other, and that helps motivate the appropriate behavior. That when we look around, we see each other as being parts of this, all parts of the same one absolute infinity of Hashem, as all identical, all literal, actual brothers, siblings, one. And then we can behave in accordance with that. Loving each other as we love ourselves. That is going to bring out the absolute infinity of Hashem that lies beneath the surface of every one of us, which is going to really set us up to be able to integrate the absolute infinity of Hashem that He's going to present to us on Shavuos. I was thinking about going on a couple minutes of something that would work really nicely here, but I don't want to run late and do it. Mr. Number.
Don't let the clock run your life. You're in Lubavitcher. We're supposed to be late.
That's actually not true. Did you not see the video, the jump video?
A chassid is a masudar. I'll try to say that.
I really
All the way back.
Oh.
Okay, I think I'm going to leave it, even if only as a practice in self-control and self-discipline.
Wow,
I'm going to close my mouth. Something I need to work on. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Started late.